I was standing in front of General Raython of the Voss Dominion when he put a plasma lance through his own command table, melted it in half, and told me that if I went to Earth, he would personally destroy my ship before I cleared the atmosphere. This was the most decorated military commander in Voss history. He had conquered 11 star systems. He had never lost a campaign. And his hands were shaking. Not from rage. From something I had never seen in a Voss officer. Something their species doesn't have a word for because they consider it a myth. He was afraid. My name is Kyle Sorenny. I'm a diplomatic investigator for the Confederated Worlds, the closest thing this region of the galaxy has to a neutral governing body. 6 months ago, I was assigned to what my superiors called the Earth File, a collection of reports, complaints, low intelligence fragments, and formal grievances filed by 7 different spacefaring civilizations, all concerning the same planet. A small blue world in an unremarkable system, inhabited by a pre-interstellar species called humans. Technologically primitive, no unified government, no faster-than-light capability, no planetary defense grid. By every metric the Confederated Worlds uses to assess threat levels, Earth rated a 0. Completely harmless. And yet, in the last 40 standard years, 4 separate species had attempted to invade it. 4 of the most powerful military civilizations in the known galaxy had sent fleets to Earth, each one capable of sterilizing the planet's surface in hours, and every single one of those fleets had come home, intact, undamaged, with no casualties, with no report of hostilities. And every single crew member, every officer, every soldier, every pilot, every individual who had been part of those invasion forces was changed, not injured, not traumatized, not brainwashed as far as anyone could detect. Changed, in ways that were subtle at first and devastating over time, and not one of them would explain what had happened on Earth. That was my assignment. Figure out what was happening. I was chosen because I'm Serenni, a species known for 2 things. We're impossible to telepathically influence, and we don't form emotional attachments easily. My superiors believed I was the ideal investigator because whatever was affecting these returned veterans couldn't affect me. They were wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. The first invasion was the Voss, 38 years ago. The Voss Dominion is the most aggressive expansionist power in the sector. Their culture is built on conquest. Their language has 40 words for different types of military victory and none for surrender. When they detected Earth's radio transmissions and calculated the planet's minimal defenses, they dispatched a standard subjugation fleet, 800 warships, 2 million soldiers, enough firepower to glass the surface twice over. The fleet entered the solar system, approached Earth, and then went silent for 11 days. No communication with Voss Command, no status updates, no distress signals, nothing. On day 12, the fleet reappeared at the edge of Voss space, intact, and returned to port. Every member of the fleet was debriefed. Every officer filed a report, and every single report said the same thing: mission unsuccessful. No hostilities encountered. Recommend Earth be classified as a non-target. When Voss Command demanded details, the fleet's officers provided none. They refused, not evasively, formally. They invoked a clause in Voss military law that I had to look up because it had never been used before, a provision for experiences beyond the jurisdiction of command. It was an ancient legal relic from before the Voss had spaceflight, originally written for soldiers who claimed to have encountered gods. Nobody had invoked it in 6,000 years. Voss Command was furious. They threatened court-martial. They threatened execution. They stripped ranks and revoked honors. And the fleet's officers accepted every punishment without protest, without defense, and without explaining what had happened during those 11 days on Earth. Me 17 officers were executed for insubordination. They went to their deaths in silence, not stoic military silence. The witnesses I spoke to described it as peaceful, content, as if the officers knew something that made dying a small thing. That alone would have been a significant intelligence anomaly. But it was what happened afterward that triggered the Earth File. Over the following years, every surviving member of the Voss Earth fleet began to change. Not overnight, gradually. Officers who had been career conquerors resigned their commissions and entered scientific research, art, philosophy, fields the Voss had historically considered worthless. Soldiers who had spent decades enforcing colonial suppression began advocating for the independence of conquered worlds. Engineers who had designed weapons began designing medical equipment, agricultural systems, infrastructure for civilian populations. The changes were individual, personal, and entirely voluntary. No one was ordered to change. No one was coerced. They simply, one by one, stopped being what the Voss Dominion had made them and started becoming something else. Within a decade, the Voss Earth veterans had become the most disruptive social force in Voss history. Not through violence, through example. They were smarter, calmer, more creative, and more persuasive than they had been before Earth. They won debates. They inspired movements. They built things that worked better than what the military-industrial establishment could produce. And they did it all while politely, firmly, and absolutely refusing to explain why. The Voss Dominion tried to contain the damage. They classified the Earth mission. They restricted the veterans' public activities. They monitored their communications. None of it worked. The changes spread. Not like a virus, like an idea. Other Voss citizens, people who had never been to Earth, began gravitating toward the veterans, absorbing their perspective, adopting their approach. Within 20 years, the Voss Dominion, the most feared military power in the sector, had begun a voluntary transition from a conquest-based empire to a collaborative federation. Not because anyone forced them, because their own people, led by a generation of soldiers who had visited a small blue planet and come back different, had decided to become something better. General Rathan was one of the few who hadn't changed. He had not been part of the Earth fleet. He had been stationed on the Voss homeworld during the invasion, and he had watched his civilization transform around him while he stayed the same. When I met him, he was one of the last senior officers still clinging to the old Dominion structure. He was also the most knowledgeable source I had on the invasion's aftermath, because he had spent 38 years trying to understand it and failing. He told me the invasion had been planned as a 72-hour operation. Land, pacify, occupy. Standard Voss doctrine. The fleet had entered orbit on schedule. Ground forces had been prepped for deployment. And then, nothing. For 11 days, the fleet orbited Earth in formation, and no landing order was given. No combat occurred. No contact with humans was reported. The fleet just sat there, in orbit. Yes, around a planet with no defenses, doing nothing. I asked him what the fleet's sensors had recorded during those 11 days. He said that was the part that made his hands shake. The sensor logs were intact. The fleet's instruments had been running the entire time, recording everything. And when Voss Command reviewed the logs after the fleet's return, the data showed nothing unusual. Earth's atmosphere, geography, electromagnetic emissions, biological signatures, everything was exactly as projected. A Class 3 pre-industrial world with a large but technologically limited population. Nothing in the data explained why the fleet hadn't landed. Nothing in the data explained why 2 million soldiers had sat in orbit for 11 days and then gone home. The data said there was no reason not to invade, and they hadn't invaded. I asked him if he thought the fleet had been mind-controlled. He said he had considered that. He had spent years considering it. But mind control doesn't make people better. Mind control doesn't turn conquerors into scientists, artists, and advocates. Mind control doesn't produce individuals who are more creative, more compassionate, and more effective than they were before. Whatever had happened on Earth wasn't control. It was something else. Something that his military training had no category for, and that his intelligence analysts couldn't model. Something that had looked at 2 million Voss soldiers and, instead of fighting them, had made them into people who didn't want to fight. That was the Voss. The second invasion, 26 years ago, was the Kethrani. A different species, different culture, different motivation. Yeah, the Kethrani are traders and resource extractors. They came to Earth not for conquest, but for mineral rights. They sent a smaller fleet, 300 ships, primarily mining vessels with military escort. They entered orbit, surveyed the planet, and went silent for 9 days. When they returned to Kethrani space, the mining fleet had been converted. The ship's holds, designed to carry extracted minerals, had been restructured into hydroponic farms. The mining equipment had been disassembled and repurposed into water purification systems. The fleet's officers filed a single report that said Earth's resources were not available for extraction and recommended the planet be placed under environmental protection. The Kethrani government, which runs on profit margins, was apoplectic. They demanded explanations. While the fleet's commanders offered none. They resigned their commissions, took their repurposed ships, and began a freelance humanitarian operation delivering food, water, and medical supplies to underdeveloped worlds across the sector. They funded it by selling the mining technology they'd converted, at cost, to anyone who wanted to build sustainable infrastructure. Within 15 years, the Kethrani Humanitarian Fleet had become the largest non-governmental aid organization in the Confederated Worlds. And the Kethrani veterans, like the Voss veterans, were changed. More empathetic, more creative, more capable, and completely silent about what had happened in orbit around Earth. The third invasion, 19 years ago, was the Dreth. I won't describe them in detail because the Dreth are, by any standard, the most brutal species in the sector. Their invasion of Earth was not for territory or resources. It was punitive. They had intercepted human radio transmissions and deemed the content offensive. That's all it takes for the Dreth. They sent a punishment fleet of 50 warships with orders to sterilize the planet's surface and move on. The fleet entered the solar system. It approached Earth. It went silent for 6 days. When it returned, the Dreth punishment fleet had been transformed into a mobile cultural preservation archive. The ships had been refitted to collect, catalog, and protect endangered artistic and intellectual traditions from across the galaxy. The commanders, officers whose previous assignments had included burning civilian populations alive, were now the most passionate preservationists in the sector. They had started with Earth. Their archives contained the most comprehensive collection of human art, music, literature, and oral history in existence, gathered during 6 days in orbit around a planet they had been sent to destroy. The Dreth hierarchy was so disturbed by this outcome that they classified the entire event and executed the fleet's senior staff. The junior officers and crew scattered across the sector, taking the archives with them. They are still operating, they are still collecting, and they are still silent. The fourth invasion, 8 years ago, was the Tyranni Collective, a hive mind species that does not have individual identity in the way most species do. The Tyranni sent a scout fleet to Earth to assess its viability as a new colony node. The fleet went silent for 3 days. When it returned, something had happened that the Tyranni Collective described as unprecedented in the history of the hive. The scout fleet's crew had individuated. They had developed separate identities, personal preferences, independent thought. They were no longer fully integrated into the collective's shared consciousness. They were still Tyranni, still biologically connected to the hive network, but they were also, for the first time in Tyranni history, persons. Individual persons with names they had chosen for themselves. The Tyranni Collective recalled the fleet, quarantined the crew, and spent 3 years trying to reintegrate them. It failed. The individuated Tyranni could not be reabsorbed. They were something new, something the collective had never produced and could not undo. And when I interviewed them, they were the closest any of the Earth veterans came to breaking the silence. One of them, who had named herself Lien, looked at me with compound eyes that had learned to express individual emotion and said, "We cannot tell you what happened because you would have to go there to understand it. And if you go there, you will not come back as the person who left." I asked her if that was a warning. She said, "It is a kindness." That was the moment the mission changed for the first time. My original objective had been straightforward: investigate the Earth anomaly, determine if it represented a threat to the Confederated Worlds, and recommend a course of action, standard diplomatic intelligence work. But sitting across from Lien, looking into eyes that had been part of a hive mind for centuries and were now unmistakably, irreversibly individual, I realized that threat was the wrong framework. The Earth anomaly wasn't attacking anyone. It wasn't damaging anyone. It was improving them. Every species that went to Earth came back better, smarter, more creative, more compassionate, more capable. The Voss stopped conquering. The Kethrani started helping. The Dreth started preserving. The Tyranni started thinking for themselves. By any objective measure, Earth's effect was beneficial. But beneficial to whom? And at what cost? Because the other thing every Earth veteran had in common, besides the improvement and the silence, was that they could not go back to what they had been. The changes were irreversible, total, permanent. A Voss conqueror who visited Earth could never be a conqueror again. A Dreth punisher could never punish again. A Tyranni drone could never be fully part of the hive again. Whatever Earth did, it did completely. It didn't persuade. It didn't negotiate. It didn't offer a choice. It simply changed you, fundamentally. And you either accepted what you became or you didn't. But either way, you couldn't undo it. I reported my preliminary findings to the Confederated Worlds Council. They were not reassured. The council chairman, a Sereni like me, a man named Aldrich Voss, who had held his position for 30 years by being cautious and unimaginative, looked at my report and asked the question that would define the next phase of my investigation. He said, "What happens when it's not invaders who go there? What happens when Earth develops interstellar travel and its humans start coming to us?" I hadn't considered that, and the moment he said it, I understood why the Earth file existed. It wasn't about the 4 invasions, it was about what came next. Humanity was a pre-interstellar species now, but they were developing fast. Their radio transmissions showed exponential technological growth. Within a generation, maybe 2, they would have faster-than-light capability. And when they did, they would leave Earth and enter the galactic community. A species from a planet that could fundamentally, irreversibly transform any intelligence that came into contact with it, not as an attack, as an effect, as something that happened just by being near it. The council didn't say the word. They didn't have to. I heard it anyway, in the silence between their careful diplomatic phrases. Containment. They were thinking about containing Earth, quarantining it, not because it was hostile, because it was transformative, because a planet that could turn conquerors into pacifists and hive minds into individuals without violence, without consent, and without explanation was the most dangerous thing the Confederated Worlds had ever encountered. Not dangerous like a weapon, dangerous like an idea. My new objective was no longer to investigate the Earth anomaly. It was to determine whether Earth should be quarantined before humanity reached the stars. And I was the person who would make the recommendation that decided whether an entire species would be locked inside their own solar system forever. I had 70 days to make that call. And the first thing I needed to do was go to Earth myself. General Rathan's plasma lance left a scar on the floor of his command center that was still smoking when his guards escorted me out. He had begged me not to go. The most feared military commander in Voss history had begged. He said the thing on Earth didn't attack your body or your mind. It attacked something deeper, something you didn't know you had until it was changed. He said the word for it in Old Voss, a language so dead that only scholars could translate it. The word meant something like the shape of what you are willing to become. I walked back to my ship thinking about that, about a planet that didn't fight invaders, that didn't resist or defend or retaliate, that simply showed them something, told them something, or was something that made them unable to continue being what they had been. I thought about 2 million Voss soldiers sitting in orbit for 11 days, looking down at a small blue world and choosing to stop being conquerors. Not because they were forced to, because they saw something that made conquest impossible to want. I set course for Earth, 70 days. And with every light year I crossed, I became less certain I was the right person for this mission. Not because I was afraid of being changed, because I was starting to wonder if being changed was the point. If the silence of every veteran, every officer, every individuated Taurani and reformed Dreth wasn't concealment at all, if they weren't hiding what happened on Earth, if they simply couldn't explain it to someone who hadn't been there, the same way you can't explain sight to someone born without eyes. Maybe the silence wasn't secrecy, maybe it was mercy. Leanne's words followed me across the void. If you go there, you will not come back as the person who left. I went anyway. I dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, and my ship's AI immediately flagged something that every previous expedition had also noted, but that nobody had been able to explain. There was nothing wrong. No anomalous readings, no unusual energy signatures, no hidden defense grid, no alien megastructure lurking behind one of the outer planets. The system was exactly what the catalog said it was. 1 medium-sized star, 8 planets, a belt of asteroids, and a small blue world third from the sun. My instruments showed me a planet with liquid water, a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, extensive biological activity, and roughly 8 billion intelligent inhabitants who had no idea I was there. By every measurable standard, Earth was unremarkable, and that was the first thing that unsettled me. Must because something unremarkable doesn't turn 4 invasion fleets inside out. I spent 2 days in the outer system running every scan my ship could produce. Long-range spectral analysis, gravitational mapping, electromagnetic intercept, quantum field detection. Everything. I found nothing that shouldn't be there. No hidden technology, no artificial structures, no energy fields, no subspace anomalies. Earth was a planet. Just a planet. Oceans, continents, weather systems, cities, agriculture, the signature clutter of a civilization still figuring itself out. My ship's AI, a Sereni-designed analytical system named Tessera that I had worked with for 12 years, concluded its assessment with a single word: normal. I moved closer, entered the inner system, past their fourth planet, a red desert world with ancient riverbeds, past their asteroid belt, approached Earth's orbit, and as I crossed what I later calculated was roughly the orbit of their moon, something happened that was not detectable on any instrument I had, but was as real as anything I have ever experienced. I felt it. Not physically, not mentally. It wasn't a signal. It wasn't a transmission. It wasn't a wave of energy or a telepathic probe. It was more fundamental than that. The closest I can come to describing it is this. Imagine you have lived your entire life in a room with no mirrors. You know yourself from the inside. You know your thoughts, your habits, your preferences, your history. But you have never seen your own face. And then someone puts a mirror in front of you. Nothing changes. No one touches you. No one speaks. You are the same person you were 1 second ago. But you will never again be the person who didn't know what they looked like. That's what happened when I crossed the threshold, not all at once, in layers, like a lens coming into focus. The first layer was memory, not new memories, my own. Every memory I had going back to childhood was suddenly available to me with a clarity I had never experienced, not recalled, present, as if the barrier between past and present had become transparent, and I could see every moment of my life simultaneously, not as a story, but as a structure, the shape of who I was, the pattern of my choices. Every time I had been cruel and known it. Every time I had been kind and meant it. Every time I had chosen comfort over honesty, safety over justice, silence over truth. All of it at once, without judgment, without interpretation. Just the pure, unedited architecture of a life I had lived without ever really looking at. Tessera registered elevated stress hormones. She asked if I was experiencing a medical event. I told her I was fine. I was not fine. I was looking at myself for the first time, and what I saw was not a monster and not a hero. What I saw was a person who had spent 43 years making decisions based on incomplete self-knowledge, who had built an entire identity around the parts of himself he was willing to examine while ignoring the parts he wasn't. I saw a man who investigated other people's problems because he had never had the courage to investigate his own. The second layer came as I entered orbit. It was broader. Not just my memories, the memories of others. Not telepathy. Nothing was being transmitted to me. It was more like the mirror had expanded. I could suddenly perceive, with the same terrible clarity, the emotional reality of the people around the choices I had made, the colleague I had undermined to get a promotion, not through malice, but through the kind of strategic indifference that the Sereni call professionalism. I felt what it had cost her, not as an abstract concept, as an experience. The subordinate I had sacrificed on a mission report to protect my own record. I felt his confusion, his anger, his eventual resignation. The partner I had left because intimacy felt like a security risk. I felt the shape of the space I left in her life. I gripped the console. Tessera was asking me questions I couldn't hear. The planet below me was just a planet. Blue oceans, white clouds, green and brown continents. 8 billion people going about their mipes, completely unaware of the Sereni diplomat in orbit having the foundations of his identity disassembled by the simple act of being nearby. And I understood, in that moment, what had happened to the Voss. 2 million soldiers, each one carrying a lifetime of conquest and suppression and colonization, suddenly confronted with the full emotional reality of what they had done. Not punished for it, not judged, just shown it. Made to see, with inescapable clarity, the faces of everyone they had ever conquered, the weight of every order they had followed, the cost, in actual suffering, of every mission they had considered a success. 11 days in orbit, and 2 million conquerors had seen themselves in a mirror that showed not just their reflection, but every bruise they had ever left on another being. No wonder they couldn't fight, not because they had been weakened, because they had been completed. They finally had all the information, and no one who has all the information can choose cruelty. That's what General Rathan was afraid of. Not that Earth took something away, that it gave something you could never return. The third layer was the one that broke me. It came on the second day. I was still in orbit, still processing the first two layers, still trying to maintain enough analytical distance to do my job when it arrived. And it wasn't about me at all. It was about them, the humans. I could feel them. 8 billion minds, none of them aware of me, but going about the ordinary business of existing. And I could feel the texture of their inner lives with the same clarity I had felt my own memories. Not their thoughts, not their plans, their emotional reality, their moment-to-moment experience of being alive. And it was, I need to choose this word carefully because nothing else fits. It was beautiful. Not because they were happy, they weren't. Most of them were struggling. Poverty, illness, grief, fear, loneliness, cruelty. The full catastrophic spectrum of suffering that comes with being a young species on a hard planet. But underneath all of it, woven through every single one of those 8 billion lives like a thread through a tapestry, was something I had never encountered in any species I had studied. They hoped, not optimism, not calculation. Not the strategic confidence that the Sereni train into their diplomats or the biological certainty that the tyranny derive from the hive. Hope. The irrational, unjustifiable, magnificent refusal to accept that suffering is the final word. Every single one of them, even the cruelest, even the most broken, even the ones who had given up on everything else, carried somewhere inside them a small, stubborn flame of belief that things could be better, that they could be better, that tomorrow might be different from today. I had studied hundreds of species. I had never encountered that. Not at that scale. Not at that depth. Not as a species-wide defining characteristic so fundamental that it saturated the emotional atmosphere of their entire planet like oxygen in air. The Voss had discipline. The Kethrani had ambition. The Dreth had certainty. Yeah, the Torani had unity. The Sereni had detachment. But the humans had hope. And hope is the most dangerous and the most transformative force in the universe because it refuses to let what is be the limit of what can be. That was it. That was the mirror. Earth's effect wasn't a weapon or a technology or a field. It was proximity. The simple experience of being close to a species that radiated hope the way a star radiates light. Get close enough, and it doesn't matter how strong your armor is or how advanced your fleet is or how deep your ideology runs. The mirror turns on. You see yourself truly. You feel what your choices have cost others. And then you feel the hope. The impossible, irrational, stubborn human hope that saturates everything within range. And in the gap between the truth of what you have been and the hope of what you could become, the change happens. Not by force, by clarity. You can't unsee yourself, and you can't unfeel the possibility of being better. I orbited Earth for 4 days. I know that because Tessera's logs say so. It felt like both an hour and a lifetime. The layers kept deepening. I saw myself with increasing resolution, and each new detail brought not shame, but something I had never felt before. Something the Sereni don't have a word for because we consider it a vulnerability. I think the humans call it compassion. Not for others. For myself. For the specific, imperfect, incomplete person I had been and the person I now understood I could become. On the 4th day, I came back to operational awareness. Tessera had maintained orbit, monitored my vitals, and recorded everything. She reported no external influences, no signals received, no fields detected, no biological agents, no alteration to my neurochemistry. By every instrument available, nothing had happened to me. I had simply orbited a planet for 4 days and sat in my chair. And I was not the same person who had arrived. I understood the silence now. Every Voss officer, every Kethrani miner, every Dreth Punisher, every individuated Torani, they all kept silent for the same reason. Not because they were hiding something, because the experience could not be translated. You can't describe a mirror to someone who has never seen their own reflection. You can't explain what it feels like to suddenly carry the full emotional weight of every choice you've ever made. You can't convey the devastating, liberating, annihilating tenderness of feeling. 8 billion strangers hope for a better tomorrow while you orbit their planet in a ship that was designed to evaluate whether they should be locked away forever. The silence wasn't secrecy. It was the recognition that some truths can only be experienced, never reported. I returned to Confederated space. I had my 70-day deadline. I had my assignment. recommend whether Earth should be quarantined before humanity reached the stars. And I sat in my cabin for 3 days trying to write the report, because the report was the hardest thing I have ever written. Not because I didn't know the answer, because I knew it completely, and the answer was going to change everything. I delivered the report in person to the council. Chairman Aldrich was there. So were representatives from every major species in the Confederated Worlds, including 2 Voss Earth veterans who had been invited as consultants but who characteristically said nothing. They just watched. With that patient, knowing expression I now recognized because I wore it myself. I told the council the truth. I told them Earth was not a weapon, not a trap, and not a threat. I told them it was a mirror. And I told them that the planet's species, the humans, radiated an emotional quality so powerful and so fundamental that proximity to it forced self-awareness onto any intelligence within range. I told them it wasn't technology, it wasn't biology, it was simply what humans were. A species so saturated with hope that being near them made you see yourself clearly and want to be better. I told them that quarantining Earth would be the single greatest crime the Confederated Worlds could commit. Not because it would harm the humans, though it would, because it would deprive the galaxy of the one thing it needed most, a species that could show other species who they really were. The council was silent for a long time. Then Chairman Aldrich asked me the question I had been dreading. He said, "Investigator Sereni, can you assure this council that your recommendation has not been compromised by the very effect you are describing?" I looked at him. I looked at the 2 Voss veterans who were watching me with something that I now understood was not smugness or satisfaction, but solidarity. The solidarity of people who have seen the same mirror and know what it costs. I said, "No, I cannot assure you of that. I have been changed. I know I have been changed. And I am telling you that the change is not a corruption. It is a completion. I am, for the first time in my life, seeing clearly. And what I see clearly is that this council is about to make a decision based on fear, and fear is what the mirror cures." Aldrich removed me from the investigation. I expected that. He appointed a new investigator, a Sereni named Terene, who had never been to Earth, and who was instructed to make her recommendation based on existing data without visiting the planet. I expected that too. The council voted to table the quarantine decision pending her report. That was 3 months ago. Terene delivered her report last week. She recommended quarantine. Permanent. Total. A blockade around Earth's solar system enforced by the combined fleets of the Confederated Worlds, preventing any contact with humanity until a mitigation strategy could be developed. The council voted to accept her recommendation. 11-3. The Voss representative voted against. The Terani representative voted against. The third dissenting vote was from a Kethrani delegate whose grandmother had been part of the Kethrani Earth fleet. Everyone else voted for containment. The blockade is being assembled now. 300 warships from 12 species, forming a perimeter around Earth's solar system, with orders to prevent any vessel from entering or leaving. Humanity will develop interstellar travel inside a cage they don't know exists, build ships designed to reach the stars, launch them, and find a wall of weapons waiting at the edge of their own system. They will be prisoners. Not because they did anything wrong, because what they are, the hope they carry, the mirror they create, is too transformative for a galaxy that is not ready to look at itself. I resigned from the diplomatic service on the day the vote was taken. So did 43 other investigators, analysts, and diplomats across the Confederated Worlds. All Earth veterans, all changed. And all silent in the particular way that Earth veterans are silent, not because we have nothing to say, but because the people who need to hear it cannot yet understand. But I'm not silent anymore. That's why I'm recording this. I am currently aboard a private vessel, unregistered, running on a false transponder, heading for Earth's solar system at maximum speed. In my hold, I am carrying a faster-than-light communication array, disassembled, with complete instructions for its construction translated into every major human language. I am going to deliver it to the surface. I'm going to give humanity the ability to speak to the galaxy before the blockade is complete. I am going to let them reach out, let their transmissions carry not just data, but the emotional resonance that every Earth veteran knows is the real message, the hope, the mirror, the unbearable compassion of a species that has suffered everything and still believes tomorrow can be better. The blockade will try to stop me. I have calculated a 14% chance of reaching Earth alive. Those are bad odds for a Sereni. We are not a species that takes irrational risks. We don't gamble. We don't hope. Except I do now. I hope. For the first time in my life, I carry that small, stubborn, irrational flame that I felt in 8 billion human hearts, and it will not let me sit in safety while a species that taught me to see myself is locked in a cage for the crime of being a mirror. General Rathan told me that Earth attacks the shape of what you are willing to become. He was right. Before Earth, I was willing to become a careful, detached, unsuccessful investigator who never risked anything that mattered. After Earth, I am willing to become a person who flies a ship at a blockade with 14% odds because a species I spent 4 days orbiting showed me that the distance between what you are and what you could be is the only distance worth crossing. The Voss veterans will understand. The Kethrani humanitarians will understand. The Dreth preservationists will understand. Lien will understand. Every changed being in the galaxy will know exactly why I am doing this, and none of them will be surprised, and most of them will be doing something similar because that is what the mirror does. It doesn't make you obedient. It doesn't make you passive. It makes you clear. And clarity, once you have scifistory, is the most dangerous force in the universe. More dangerous than fleets. More dangerous than quarantines. More dangerous than every weapon the Confederated Worlds can assemble, because you can blockade a planet, you can cage a species, you can vote to contain the most transformative force the galaxy has ever encountered, but you cannot stop people who have seen themselves clearly from acting on what they see. The blockade is 300 warships. There are currently 6,412 known Earth veterans scattered across the Confederated Worlds. Veterans who were changed, veterans who went silent, veterans who have spent years and decades quietly becoming better, building better things, helping other species, and waiting. They are not waiting anymore. I don't know how many of them are heading for Earth right now. I don't know how many of them have already loaded communication arrays, scientific packages, cultural archives, or simply themselves onto ships and pointed them at the small blue planet that showed them who they really were. I don't know if any of us will make it through the blockade, but I know this. The Council voted to contain hope, and hope, by its very nature, is the one thing that cannot be contained. 14% odds. I'll take them.